before we start, I want to point out that what I say will be most relevant to those of you who are already familiar with the basic concepts of ABM, and also those that are convinced that ABM is your next strategy or growth area. So as a project manager, I get a broad overview of where different clients are at and which strategic and tactical decisions we take in our collaborations. So to sort of complement the other two presentations that we've had today, I will focus on the more day-to-day situation and day-to-day struggles that we see some of our clients face. And to guide this presentation, I summarized the 3 most frequently asked questions that I, but also the other project managers here at Bright Vision get when it comes to ABM collaborations. So the first question is, how can we run a first pilot? Then how do we build this into a program? And last, and what are the best practices for ABM strategies? So these are the 3 questions that will guide us today. But let's start at the beginning, the first pilot. So if you're not embarrassed by the first version of your ABM strategy, you've launched too late. If there was only one thing I was allowed to tell our clients when preparing for a pilot, it would probably be this, given we can take this with a sense of humor. But this alter quote from Reid Hoffman, the founder of LinkedIn, shows that not only the idea to approach a strategy with lead gen and agile mindset is suitable, but also it summarizes all the best practices I will share with you today. And one driving thought that I can share with you already that will make preparing for a pilot significantly easier is to remember that perfection doesn't exist. And it doesn't need to exist for a pilot project. So from our client work, we've seen that the focus for you should rather be on setting sufficient foundations and then just starting. So because the pilot is also a learning experience after all. And before we continue, I also want to point out that your first pilot will look very different from your partners or competitors, but it will be a start. So you have to find something that fits to you and your team. So before we cover the how and how to run a pilot, I wanted to talk about the what. So when we talk to our clients, we are frequently asked, what's the right scope, the right investment, the right budget, the right approach? So the short answer is that every initiative will look different from the next. However, there are different reasons for that, and that can be your internal team structures, your company structure, your company industry, your target audience, your budget, timeline, and so forth. And I want to point out that different doesn't mean better or worse. And in our opinion, a successful pilot manager will understand what it is that the team can and perhaps also wants to do for an ABM pilot. So the goal here is to sort of strike that balance between being ambitious and being realistic. So I brought with me 3 examples of campaigns that we have been running, and they have been in different countries, different industries. And the reason why that's important to mention is because it might help you to determine which number of accounts is a good start for you. So if we look at these examples here, the first client was targeting existing clients in one language in Sweden. So naturally, that makes for a much smaller list than, for example, the third client who focused on cold account acquisition in the Benelux region. So with the second client here, just in contrast, we started out with 15 accounts and over time narrowed it down to 8 as the others didn't really show the willingness to have a meeting yet, which was the goal of the pilot. And this also brings me to my second point about what a pilot should look like. The budget is a huge factor in deciding how it can be executed, unsurprisingly. And to give an example, so for the second collaboration, we settled on promoting the campaign primarily in digital, paid media channels, as this was at the time the most cost-efficient way to sort of test first ABM elements. So when you think about it, this pilot was essentially an account-based advertising campaign. And that might not sound as much, but for this client, this was already a significant step towards ABM and also self-sufficient marketing, as they previously relied on referrals from their partners. So when creating your pilot target account list, do keep in mind that the common denominators mean everything. So think about the common denominators between the different accounts. If you struggle to identify the common denominators, it might be that your list is just too big or too vague. And the other factor that helped us decide the scope of these pilots was the existing relationship with sales. So what I mean by that is that in example one, they were a really close-knit team that was fully excited to work together with a more ABM-focused approach. And essentially the open communication between the teams was what made it easier to aim for identifying upsell and cross-sell opportunities and actually support each other throughout their expansion. So that also their prospects had a sort of coherent experience, whoever and whatever they interacted with. To give you sort of an example at the other end of the spectrum, we have client 3 here, who in contrast did not have a very engaged sales team yet and no in-house BDRs. Regardless, for that pilot then, because of that lack of knowledge sharing and that they had internally, we decided it would be more useful to use Bright Vision's telemarketing team to then first help gather insights about the target audience and create content based on that. So to sum it up, ABM pilots are as unique as the companies that run them, but there are a few best practices that can help you and your team decide what scope and setup is right for you. So adding to my previous point about how to run a pilot, I brought this spectrum with me. And I know I'm risking to oversimplify behavioral science here, but I do like the spectrum because it shows the range between 2 different types of approaches, individuals or company cultures. So you have here the planner and the doer. So the planner strives for perfection, doing everything in their power to control the future and outcome of certain marketing and ABM activities, such as, well, a pilot. The planner would say something like this before running an activity. And when you think about it, saying something like this can actually create stagnation. It can lead to activities never happening. And in contrast, you have the doer who wants to make things happen quickly, take action right away and get things out of the door. And the doer knows that perfection is a myth, but also doesn't really care about getting organized and setting these groundwork structures. So in practice, these 2 people can be represented in one team, one person, one company. And the planner is not better than the doer or vice versa. In fact, I would actually argue that you need both team members in your team, or maybe even within one person, that you have a tendency to do a bit of both. And the reason why I'm referring back to it is because that we at Bright Vision have seen that an important part of running a pilot for ABM, but also other strategies, is to embrace the different perspectives. So you as a team and an organization, after all, sort of need to find that balance between the 2 extremes to run a successful pilot. And you might also want to refer back to this spectrum when you're choosing an agency for support or hiring additional team members. So before we talk about ABM programs, let me round up by sharing some best practices and answering the guiding questions. Let's assume you and your team have already taken the first hurdle, deciding that ABM is your next strategy. So when we look at these points here, it's good to mention before we have a look at them, is that treating the pilot as a proof of concept is sort of the overarching goal, right? And when we think of good understanding of targets, what we mean by that is that it's important to point out that you should have an ideal customer profile and that you have a defined buyer persona and that you can use as best practices for your pilot. And if your team doesn't have that yet, or you're not sure what I'm talking to just now, you might want to go back to the drawing board and think about how to prepare for a pilot. So the point also refers to the accounts on your ABM target list. I already mentioned the common denominators are everything, and you need to make sure that you have them very well fleshed out, so also your sales team can understand why you're going after these accounts. And that said, it's good for a pilot to have named accounts, but it's not a must. It is perfectly possible to run a pilot with just account names. That said, as an additional advice, we usually recommend to not pick your least defined or most difficult target segment or target audience segment. Because think about it, after all, you're trying to prove a concept, and that's really difficult if you can't get the results in the time that you have. So thinking about the ad platforms, we usually say that you don't need an elaborate ABM tool if this is really the first time that you're ever doing an activity like this. Of course, if you can afford it monetarily, but also from the resources and capabilities you have in-house, that's great. But if you can't, it's not a deal breaker. You can run pilots with the tracking that you have in place and also the platforms that you have in place. For collaboration with sales, as I mentioned, it doesn't need to be the whole team. Start with one member if needed, and then sort of practice that alignment and see what works. And when we look at the project milestones, I think this is also it's a given. So this point refers back to the structure that is needed, right? So having a defined and limited scope, but also making sure you're flexible as you go. So that, for example, if you run a pilot that is like 3 to 4 months, you of course can only mimic the success of a fully fleshed out program that might span over even more months or years. And that is a last point, learning and insights. I would say that's one that's particularly close to my heart. And we at Bright Vision here consider this a best practice. And what I mean by learnings and insights is that decide what you want to learn beforehand and then write it down and make sure you are able to track it. So it's easy to say that you want to learn something, but to really show that progression and success and also value from the pilot, you need to define where you're at now, where the team knowledge is now, and really where you want to go. So, and this is not on the list, but I'll share this with you regardless, which is to advocate honestly and early. So by the time you finished your first pilot, you want the broader team already to be aware and hopefully have gotten excited about what you're doing. So bring it up in meetings that you're doing this initiative, make sure that there are educational materials available, and also slowly start to involve more and more people as you move through the pilot into a program. So when we cover all these best practices, we also encourage our clients to ask themselves the following questions. Can it be repeated, and can it be scaled? Because this is essentially what it comes down to when you're building a program. So when I say this, I refer to the entire strategy, the execution, and also the workload. So having talked about the pilot now, let's talk about the program. So the program is essentially a mapped out version of your growth strategy. And ideally, it's designed to be flexible and to grow, both marketing and sales, so that they can succeed together. And one question we also discuss internally in our team is when does a pilot become a program, right? Like, how do you know if you have a pilot or a program? So this is, of course, not a complete framework, but when you begin to grow from multiple pilots or just one pilot into a program, we usually look at these three aspects. So the first one is that ABM isn't a single campaign. It's a long-term growth strategy. So this point likely doesn't need much explanation. But what I mean by this is that a campaign will cover one aspect at a given time of the buyer's journey. And a program is rather part of your overall strategy and should be implemented with a deeper but also wider range than one single campaign. The other thing is that pilots jump ahead. So it is possible to generate quick results from ABM, but it is unrealistic to expect them. So as I said, pilots usually have a shorter duration as it's more of a proof of concept for developing a fully fleshed out program. And what we've seen is that by the time the buyer actually turns into a lead, a lot has happened. Like, they have had quite the journey already. So when you see how your pilot might cover one aspect, perhaps trying to get people to actually sign up to something, there's a lot of the buyer's journey left that is uncovered. And this is what your program should achieve. And then as a last point, the culture and attitude. And in our opinion, for ABM to become a success, there needs to be a culture within your organization, or at least within your team, to sort of allow for testing and learning. So if you work in this all or nothing culture where the potential for ABM lives and dies on the success of the pilot, it might just not be the right environment for ABM to thrive in the future. And I think this even more so translates to the sales and marketing alignment. While for a pilot, you technically need like minimum one engaged salesperson, for a program, you need buy-in from sales, but also management. So to give you an even more specific example of the difference between a pilot program, a pilot campaign and a program this way around, looking at this sort of simplified graph of a company's ABM campaign over time and also their varying performance, as you can see. And these are standalone campaigns that aren't directly connected. This this is a way of running ABM, and we've also done it with some clients. But according to our definition, it's not a program. So if you look at this graph in comparison, you can see how the multiple campaigns actually fit within a program. And as you also can see is that even within the best program, performance will vary. There hopefully is an upward trend, but it is not a given that every campaign will work better than the last. And that's why I think it's important to point out that within a program, it would be fatal to consider campaigns only on their individual performance, right? Because in the end, they're supposed to build on each other, if not by topic, at least by the learnings that you've gotten from them. And sort of this interconnectedness of the campaigns that you're running, that's what should be reflected in the team structure, as that's when even sort of less well-performing campaigns can produce valuable insights. And then within a program, you can use these insights to actually improve in the future. But let me give you a possible answer to the guiding question. So when it comes to building a program for your company or unit, think about one simple mantra: fail fast, succeed faster. So again, I know this is closely related to this entire agile startup, lean product building world. And there has been a book written about this with an eponymous title. But the reason why I would like to bring it up is because you need a strategy that is sort of supporting both your short-term goals, but also your long-term dreams. And when we think about this mantra, what it tells us is that we have to build a program incrementally. So a company that actually embraces this fail fast philosophy does develop their program or their strategy incrementally, sort of continually testing, experimenting, learning, growing as you go. And our recommendation is building an ABM program by having sort of this phased approach so you can optimize as you go. The other thing there is the holistic approach. So to really scale and develop a pilot into a long-term strategy is that to consider the things that weren't so crucial for the pilot that do become important for a program. So as I mentioned earlier, sort of this interconnectedness of things and the holistic thinking, that's where ABM then becomes more than a marketing campaign, and this is where it becomes a more mature growth strategy. Again, this translates even more so for the sales and marketing alignment. So one thing I like to recommend when we think about moving from one single campaign into sort of this broader initiative, make sure that you do have an ABM ambassador from the start, and then sort of start sprinkling information about what you're doing about this initiative early on. Do so while you're running the program, while you're running the pilot, so you can actually start building the program and get more people involved over time. The last thing that I also want to point out, which is sort of connected to, so the last 2 points are sort of connected, which is the striving for growth. So if you grow your program too rapidly or your ABM strategy too rapidly, it can actually harm your overall plan. So ABM is also a good chunk of change management needed, especially if it's a new way of working for the entire company. So if there is a lack of preparation for this growth, making sure you get everybody on board over time, making sure you get the right data in place, then that can actually hurt your initiative in the long run. So think back to the spectrum that I showed you when we talked about the pilot, so the planner and the door. And I think for developing a program, it's even more important that you balance both aspects. And then the last point, but definitely not the least one, is the commitment and the patience. So this point for me touches upon expectation management across the team, but also across management. And in order to build an ABM program and essentially a new growth strategy, as I said, it is change management. So you do need a lot of commitment and also tenacity if you're the one pushing for it internally. And that said, you will not build a program overnight, and the program probably won't show its full potential within the first 4 months, especially not if your sales cycle is maybe 16 months. So for all the ABM ambassadors at your company, if it's you or some other team members, be committed and build commitment with other team members as you go. And I know this is easier said than done, but it is a really good thing to keep in mind when you move forward. So to summarize what I said now about a pilot, about a program, summarize, it is essentially to adopt a crawl, walk, run approach to your ABM tactics, strategy, and program so that you can actually move from pilot to program. All right, so this was it from me. Thank you very much for listening.